Shalom. I'd like to give an all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahweh Shai. All right, double honors to the apostles and elders of the great millstone who rule well. We've been speaking about the all right, the Federal Reserve. And here, the clip, a couple minutes long of this guy, G. Edward Griffin, describing what are the benefits of the Federal Reserve for the government and the banking cartels who came up with it. All right. And the reason that he calls them cartels is because it's exactly what it is. It's the Federal Reserve is essentially a private entity. All right. And it's ran by who? It's ran by the bankers. All right. It's banked by the Morgans, JP Morgan, all right, Rockefellers, Rothschild, and Warburgs. All right. And they decided to create this system so that they can essentially create money, all right, out of thin air, charge interest on that money, and eliminate competition from all smaller banks. All right, that was the goal in mind. All right, but the ultimate goal in mind is to essentially enslave, all right, the American populace and ultimately the world, all right, and have them enslaved to a digital currency, all right, attached to a digital currency, and that digital currency, all right, is going to be the way that they buy and that they sell. And at any time anyone talks any bad about the banking families or about the government that's reigning over the populace, they can always just turn off your ability to spend money and essentially starve you out into compliance. All right. So without further ado, here we have G. Edward Griffin.
And in order to find out what the payoff is, we'll have to examine how the Federal Reserve System creates money, because that's the key. Now, if you're not familiar with how money is created in America, this is going to be really some experience to go through this for the first time. You're going to shake your heads and say, I don't believe this. I call it the Mandrake mechanism, after that 1940s comic book character, Mandrake the Magician. It create something out of nothing, wave his cape, and it was back into the void again. That's the Federal Reserve System. Now, let's take this and break this down. I need to warn you in advance, however, that you shouldn't try and make sense out of this. Because you'll blow it.
And that's deep that he says that. He says you shouldn't try to make sense out of this. All right. Because the so-called white man is the author of confusion, man. The so-called white man is deliberately the author of confusion. All right, that's all I had to say.
Confused, if you think this makes sense, just remember, this is your plain old American scam that we're talking about here. It's that simple. And I'm going to strip away all of the banker terminology and all the accounting terminology and use just plain old plodding English to make it comprehensible. In spite of that, however, I want you to know that everything I'm going to tell you from a technical point of view is 100% accurate, in spite of the simplicity of the language. Okay, with that by way of preliminary, let's get right to the Mandrake mechanism itself. It starts with the government side of the partnership. It starts in Congress, when Congress is spending money far and beyond what it takes in taxes.
Which is the situation we
How can Congress spend more money than its income in taxes? Basically, what happens is the Congress goes down to the Treasury and asks for, let's say it's $1 billion more that they need this day. And the Treasury official says, you guys got to be kidding. We don't have any money here. You spent it all long ago. Everything we taken in taxes is long spent. And Congress says, well, we kind of figured that was the case, but we thought somebody might have dropped by and left some money. They said, we know what we'll do. We'll borrow the rest of it. So they go down the street to the printing office. Now, notice they're not going to print money. They're going to print certificates, nice, big, fancy certificates with borders on the corner and an eagle at the top and a seal at the bottom. And it'll say United States Treasury bond or note or bill, depending on the length of maturity. And it's so impressive, it almost looks like money. But if you hold it up to light, it really says IOU. That's all they are. And so Congress takes it and it wants the public to step forward and loan them money in exchange for the IOUs. Sometimes that's called buying bonds. No, you're not buying anything. You're loaning money to the government and getting an IOU in return. And a lot of people in the private sector and institutions are anxious to loan money to the government. Why? Because they have heard that it's the best investment you can possibly make, the most secure investment, because it is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. And that people aren't quite sure what that means, but it sure sounds good. And so they lend the money. But just in case there's anyone here in doubt as to what that means, I'd like to explain it to you. The full faith and credit of the United States government means that the federal government solemnly promises to pay you back your money plus interest. If it has to take everything you've got in the form of taxes to do it, it will do it. It's a promise to tax you. And people won't think this thing through. They think, oh, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful investment, and I'm going to get some of my money back. Anyway, that's a little side issue. The government is able to borrow a tremendous amount of money and therefore spend more than it takes in taxes through this process. But never enough. They always need more than that. Not to worry, they say. They walk further down the street to the Federal Reserve building. Now the Fed has been waiting for them. That's one of the reasons it was created. They walk in there and the Federal Reserve officer opens up his desk drawer, pulls out a big checkbook, and he writes a check to the United States Treasury for $1 billion and hands it to them. Now we need to stop and ask a question. Where did they get that money? $1 billion, that's a lot of money. Who put the money into that account of the Federal Reserve so they could give it to Congress or to the Treasury? And the answer is there is no money there. There's absolutely zero. There's just a checkbook. Well, if you and I were to do that, we would go to jail. But they can do it because Congress wants them to do it. This, in fact, is the payoff. This is the benefit to the government for being in the partnership. The government can go to the Federal Reserve and obtain instant amounts of any amount of money they want without having to confront the taxpayer and say, we're going to raise your taxes for this money directly. It would be very unpopular if Congress had to go to the public and say, we have a lot of money we want to take from you folks, and it's going to cost you $3,000 per family more than it did last year. You know how long they'd last in office. So they like this Mandrake mechanism very well. The public doesn't know that it's costing them anything. It's just how it works somehow. So this money, this $1 billion, springs into being precisely at the instant that the Federal Reserve officer signs the check and gives it to the government. Now let's see where the banking cartel benefits from this partnership. We'll go back to that $1 billion check and follow it. The Treasury official deposits it into the checking account of the federal government. And immediately all the computers start to whir and the ledgers show that the government now has $1 billion deposit, $1 billion in its account, and so therefore it can write checks up to $1 billion. Government checks start flowing. Let's just follow a $100 check. Make this real simple. To the fellow that delivers our mail. The postal worker gets a $100 check. And he looks at this and he can't imagine in his wildest dreams that just 2 days ago, that money didn't exist anywhere in the universe. But it's a government check now. It's very spendable. So he takes it and deposits it into his private checking account at the local commercial bank. Now this money is out of the Federal Reserve mechanism per se, out of the government side of the partnership, and it gets into the private banking side of the partnership. $100 has been deposited. Now the action heats up. The banker looks at that and he goes over to the loan window and he opens it up and he says, attention everybody, we have money to loan. And that's good news for a lot of people because that's one of the reasons we go to the bank, isn't it? To borrow money. So it's good news when there's money available. And the banker says, we have $100 deposited, but don't worry, folks, we can loan you more than that. We can loan you up to $900. Well, how? How can you loan out up to $900 when you only have $100 deposited? Well, it's not difficult if you're in the Federal Reserve System. Here's how it works. The Federal Reserve says that the member banks must keep no less than 10% of their deposits in reserve. So there's $100. They keep 10% in reserve, $10. And they can loan up to $90, right? So we loan it to you, ma'am. You borrowed $90. What do you do with it? Well, you want to spend it. So you want to write a check on it. You deposit it into your checking account.
All right, so right now he's describing the fractional reserve currency, fractional reserve banking, which is how these banks operate. All right, that's why when you go to the bank and you tell them, let's say you have $40,000 in your bank account and you want to go and take out all the $40,000 in one shot, usually the bank will tell you that you can, and they'll try to they'll make it very difficult, or they'll straight up tell you that they don't have that money in there. It's because of this mechanism known as fractional reserve banking. He's not calling it that, but as you continue to listen, you'll see that basically the banks keep a fraction of what they're giving you or what they're loaning you of what you're depositing. All right. They keep a fraction of it and then they lend out another portion of it, and then they end up charging interest on it.
So you can write a check. In many cases, it might be put directly into your checking account. But now there's $90 deposit. In addition to the $100 that was deposited to start this chain, now we've got the $90 that was loaned as another deposit. Well, the Federal Reserve says that you only have to keep 10%. So we keep 10% of the 90 and loan the other 90%. And the person that borrows that puts it right back into the bank as another deposit. Well, the Federal Reserve says you only have to keep 10%. So this goes around and around and around to the revolving door until finally the whole action is played out. And the bottom line is when that $100 deposit comes in from the postal worker, the banks, in essence, can loan up to $900 because $100 is the reserve, and that's 10% of 1,000. So they can loan the balance or the difference, which is $900. Now, where does that money come from? Well, same place. It springs into being precisely at the point where the loan is made. It didn't exist before anywhere. Now, notice the important thing here. The money that's created out of nothing and given to the government spends for its purposes. But the money that's created out of nothing by the banks is not spent by the banks. It's loaned by the banks to you and to me, and we pay interest on it. Not too shabby. Interest on nothing. I wish I had a magic checkbook like that, where I didn't have to have any money, just a checkbook. And I could write checks, $10,000, $20,000, $100,000 all day long and loan them to you folks, and you pay me interest on it. You see? Not too shabby at all. This, in fact, is the payoff to the commercial banks in the cartel. This scam has become legitimized by law. And we're told it's a wonderful thing. We think our banking system is wonderful, but it's a scam. Not only interest on nothing, but perpetual interest on nothing, because notice, once this money is created, if you pay it back, they have it on their ledger as a credit. They can loan it out again to somebody else. And the whole object is to keep it loaned out. They don't like the money not loaned out because you can't earn interest on it. When it's in the inkwell, it doesn't do them any good. So remember, there's nothing here except ink in the well or electronic impulses in the computer. That's all there is. So they're collecting interest on that. But that's not the end of the process. That is how money is created in America, but that's not the end of it because it has consequences. What impact does that have on us? Are we involved in this in any way? Well, yes, we are. I've heard people say, gee, those fellows are really smart. I guess they deserve to be rich. As though it didn't affect them in any way. Let's follow it. This money that's created out of nothing goes into the economy, and it dilutes down the value of the dollars that were already out there. It's like pouring water into the pot of soup. It dilutes the soup. And so the economy is diluted by these new dollars, and prices start to go up, or they appear to be going up. It's the process called inflation. I say appear to go up because prices really don't go up, ladies and gentlemen. What's happening is that the value of the dollar goes down. That's what we're witnessing here. If we had a real monetary system, real money backed by gold or silver or anything of tangible value, coffee cups, anything that couldn't just be created out of nothing behind our money, you would find that the purchasing power of that money would remain constant over a long period of time. And to illustrate that point, it's interesting to know that if we had lived in ancient Rome and had a 1-ounce gold coin, we would have been able to buy a fine toga, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of sandals. That was the price. So today, what can we buy with a 1-ounce gold coin? We can walk into any men's store and buy a really fine suit, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of shoes. The real price of these items hasn't changed in thousands of years when expressed in terms of real money. But when expressed in terms of these things we carry around, we call them dollars. They're not. They're really Federal Reserve notes. They buy less and less and less because they keep creating more and more and more of them, and they dilute the economic soup. But we still haven't followed this to the end of the trail. We've lost some purchasing power through this thing called inflation. But how many people ask the question, who gained it? Did anybody gain our lost purchasing power, or did it just evaporate and go up to heaven somewhere? Somebody gained it, didn't they? But we don't know who. Let's follow it. The people who gained our lost purchasing power were those who were at the point where this fresh money was injected into the economic soup. Those at the nozzle get dollars that look the same as all the other dollars, and they have them first, and they can spend them at full purchasing power. But by the time the person who gets those dollars then gives them to the next person and the next person, it goes out toward the edge of the pot where most of us are, and it gets diluted down. But the ones up there at the nozzle are the ones who have gained our lost purchasing power. Who are they? Well, we know that the government is one of them. That's where the billion-dollar check started, isn't it? That was the beginning of this whole process. The government spent that money first. And then, of course, those who work for the government and those who have government contracts and those who get grants and so forth get the next wave, and they're not doing too bad either.
All right, so that's pretty much it in terms of him explaining how the Federal Reserve System works. All right, so this, like he said, was written into law. So one more time, we need to bring this out. It says, woe, this is Isaiah 10:1. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees and that write grievousness which they have prescribed. Exactly, man. This is an unrighteous thing. This is an unrighteous decree, man. Essentially, these people have a money printing machine, all right? And what the government does is that since the value of the dollar continues to go down, all right, they essentially charge you the difference. All right, they charge you. The way that that money needs to be paid for is through taxes, but instead of directly taxing you, what they'll do is that they create inflation and you end up paying for that money that way. All right, by way of inflation. So inflation, as he explained, is essentially another way of a tax. All right. So this is Isaiah chapter 10, verse 1. It says, woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees and that write grievousness, which they have prescribed. All right. So woe, destruction onto them. This is why the Lord needs to come, man. This is why the Lord needs to save his people. All right. Because this so-called white man is completely out of control, man. All right. And that was part 2. And part 3, we're just gonna go over the scriptures and the end goal, the ultimate end goal of these people. All right. So until next time, shalom.